Boss, come over here and get a two-shot of me and Ned. Ned, come in here. Action!
There are many ways to guide a viewer's attention to what is important in a given scene.
Would you like to join my crew?
Right. That's good, hold that.
And yes, motion is actually an incredibly effective device here, literally using the camera as a tool to point out what is most relevant.
The sound you just heard is the landing gear locking into place.
A steady zoom out, or a crash zoom in, craning high to intensify suspense, or low to immerse us deeper in the story and minds of the characters. Camera movement can make us feel a character's exhilaration, triumph, or dread. It can permit us to follow characters as they traverse the setting of a film's narrative for a brief period, or an impressively lengthy amount of time.
We should at least wait until it's dark. Erinmore said to leave immediately. Erinmore's never seen No Man's Land.
But this doesn't mean that static shots can't be visually interesting. Such framing can be used to more accurately capture everyday life and the people within it, or to allow screen time to become real-time, giving the often minimized day-to-day actions of a woman value on screen. Some filmmakers like to juxtapose these relatively static shots against camera movements, such as whip pans and super zooms, while others like to leave their films void of movement until a pivotal point in the story. But how does a film earn its static shots? How do filmmakers maintain the rhythm, pacing, and visual interest of a scene without camera moves? And how do filmmakers strike a balance between stillness and motion? Well, lens choice certainly plays an important role in how filmmakers can communicate meaning. Whether it's using telephoto lenses to compress the space and the characters within it, or wider lenses allowing for a greater depth of field and a broader plane of focus. Like our eyes, these lenses allow viewers to see staging both in the foreground and background, permitting filmmakers to shoot an entire scene without the need for cutaways, and often giving narratives a more realistic feel. Of course, not all filmmakers rely on wide lenses for this immersive depth. Throughout the 50s, Kurosawa often used telephoto lenses at higher apertures to maintain this deep focus style. And when a filmmaker chooses to play with depth, it can communicate meaning in visually interesting ways. For 2018's Cold War, director Pavel Pawlikowski did just this, relying on a mix of lenses and shooting styles to reflect the arc of the narrative. At the film's open, the camera remains relatively static. The image, moderately low contrast. That is, until Zula enters the picture. She becomes the trigger that causes the camera to move and the overall contrast of the image to increase. Throughout the start of the film in Poland, cinematographer Lucas Zal relied on wide lenses at higher apertures to give depth to the frames and allow the characters to blend in with their surroundings. When the narrative shifts to Paris, the lenses become longer, the apertures lower, effectively blurring the background and alienating the characters from their new setting. The juxtaposition of these compositional elements creates impactful images that chart the emotional arcs of the characters. Here, Pawlikowski is able to visually engage the audience with relatively still frames, only relying on camera movement when prompted by the characters and story. And this brings up an incredibly important factor when discussing the balance between stillness and motion. Why does a filmmaker choose to move the camera? Filmmakers can tell stories with lots of camera movements and fast cuts, or stationary images and longer shot lengths. Neither is better than the other, and it's incredibly interesting to see how these two distinct visual styles can function together. But what's important is why and how filmmakers communicate meaning through these choices. The work of Antonioni serves as an excellent example of how camera movement can convey meaning in unconventional ways. His films frequently juxtapose stillness against motion and presence against absence, often punctuating long, contemplative images with tracking or pans to empty frames. These moves feel detached from the narrative and yet simultaneously convey meaning in a way that scripting and dialogue can't. And it was this that inspired director Kogonada when making 2017's Columbus.
I like this building.
Isn't it great?
While most scenes consist of simplistic, yet strikingly composed, locked-off frames, the film does feature several long, masterful tracking shots. Here, as in Antonioni's films, the camera only moves when there is a reason to.
My name's Casey. It's actually Cassandra, but everyone calls me Casey.
Jen.
Such moves are scarce, but purposeful, and moreover, present interesting ways of covering scenes outside of the more conventional shot-reverse shot. And Kogonada actually uses unconventional coverage at several points in this narrative.
Oh, wait, weren't you 18? And you declared your love to me?
One such scene occurs later in the film, where an intimate conversation between two characters is captured in one long static shot, utilizing mirrors rather than cuts or close-ups as framing devices. Mirrors themselves actually present interesting opportunities for coverage in these long static frames. Take Ruben Östlund's Force Majeure, another film that is largely absent of camera movement. Like Kogonada, Östlund cleverly makes use of a mirrored bathroom to cover a scene in a less conventional way. However, the compositions feel less intimate and more unsettling than those in Columbus. Östlund's camera feels more clinical, lacking the emotional weight Antonioni and Kogonada's frames bear. In keeping the frame still and the shot length long, he removes the subjectivity that camera motion and cutting often provides. And he's not the only filmmaker that uses the cinematic style to play with our notions of perspective. Michael Haneke's 2005 thriller Caché opens with an almost 2-minute and 30-second long static shot. It feels excessively long precisely because of our expectation that something is going to happen, only nothing does. Until two characters begin speaking over the image, revealing we are not observing a scene from the movie, but a recording. Thus begins Haneke's exercise in observation. As the film unfolds, what we see cannot necessarily be trusted.
Tu peux pas me faire simplement confiance?
Moi, je dois te faire confiance? Mais pourquoi pas l'inverse pour une fois?
Are we watching a recording or the movie itself? Some scenes start as seeming surveillance, only to turn to movement, revealing themselves to be part of the movie. Others feel like part of the narrative, only to reveal themselves to be recordings.
La cassette dure encore plus d'une heure, tu peux la regarder puis voir comment il va.
In filming Caché in this way, the narrative calls into question notions of guilt and innocence, and our collective culpability in the denial of our past injustices. And this concealed camera style of filmmaking was something director Jonathan Glazer wanted to utilize in 2023's The Zone of Interest.
I think the most significant thing in this look is just to be objective, try to not to judge anything. Just observe.
Glazer had the goal of making the film as authorless as possible. To achieve this, he and cinematographer Lucas Saul relied on multiple hidden cameras, mainly practical lighting, and wide, sharp lenses to accommodate their deep, geometrically centered 16:9 framing. The image itself feels relatively muted and objective. It lacks the manipulation or aesthetic beauty a more cinematic aspect ratio, shallower depth of field, or pleasing lighting setup could have afforded. Glazer frames the film in a way that makes you feel uncomfortable. The image is confronting precisely because of its lack of any seeming subjectivity or judgment, precisely because of its proximity to our own world.
With this story and with this topic, we are not looking for any attractions. We need to just witness this, and we can't do anything, we can't add anything. We shouldn't look for an attraction and just capture this reality.
But in utilizing these static, long-held framings, not all filmmakers are going for realism. Roy Andersson's films use this tableau-like static camera in more painterly ways that investigate what it means to be human. In virtually shadowless vignettes, his characters, often caked in white makeup, are left incredibly exposed, this vulnerability punctuated by the drab costumes and alarmingly beige color palettes of his scenes. His set design and the objects, people, and props within them are meticulously placed, his camera situated in the perfect position to allow these vignettes, some relatively short and others much longer, to unfold. And it was exactly this painterly style that interested director David Lowery when he began working on 2017's A Ghost Story.
Why are you laughing? I'm so scared. I don't know. I'm just scared.
Drawing inspiration from the work of the Taiwanese New Wave directors, the film has a relatively slow but deliberate pacing, wherein each frame has the capacity to engage the audience on an emotional level. Lowery initially conceived of the film as being composed entirely of striking tableaus where each frame could itself be taken as a still. And A Ghost Story does allow several key scenes to play out in long, static frames. However, in a similar manner to Cold War, Lowery ultimately decided to mix various shooting styles that reflected the different phases of the narrative. As the film progresses, the camera language changes. The shots expand, becoming less rigid and more mobile. The slow and deliberate pacing accelerates as the narrative draws closer to its conclusion. But the image alone is not the only tool at a filmmaker's disposal when trying to maintain the rhythm, pacing, and visual interest of a scene. Jacques Tati's films serve as excellent examples of how sound can guide the viewer's attention in the absence of close-ups or camera moves. Take 1967's PlayTime, where sonic close-ups stand in for visual ones.
Could you give me the exact figures on the consolidated account?
Here, not unlike the films discussed earlier, Tati utilizes long shots and deep focus to allow meticulously staged gags to play out, often accentuated by farcical sound effects. From overlapping dialogue and conversations to endlessly tapping footsteps and puffing chairs. Tati's impressive set design, meticulously choreographed scenes, and creative use of color work with his inventive soundscapes to guide our eyes to what's important in these large, wide frames. But when relying on sound to focus the audience's attention, sometimes a filmmaker will strip a scene bare of any visual interest at all. When a sound can replace an image, cut the image or neutralize it. This is what Robert Bresson said in his 1975 book when discussing how sound functions in film. For 2008's Hunger, director Steve McQueen was inspired by the sonic simplicity of Bresson's A Man Escaped, not wanting Hunger to feel or sound like a conventional prison film with its clanking keys, slamming doors, and background yelling. Much has been said about this film's impressive 17-minute long take. And Sean Bobbitt's cinematography is breathtaking, but the function of Paul Davies' sound design in this static framing is truly not something to be ignored.
Bit of a break from smoking the Bible, eh?
Davies' sound design in Hunger illustrates its uncanny ability to fill in the gaps of what we as viewers can't see, what the camera doesn't show us. As McQueen himself noted when discussing this film, a sound can give you the dimensions of a room. It can give you smell, it can give you tension. In some ways, sound can travel itself into other areas of our senses, other areas of our psyche that unfortunately cannot be just viewed. The sound design in this film is very much focused on the details. Softer sounds like water running, a fly buzzing, and a broom sweeping are played out against much louder sounds like trash can lids clanking against the ground and batons banging against plastic shields, passing on feelings of tension, confinement, and anxiety to the audience. The soundtrack provides an interiority that the image alone cannot. Much in the same way that Bresson's use of sound in A Man Escaped compels the audience to really listen, Davies' use of a relatively sparse sound design and very little scored music in Hunger makes it so that each sound that is used resonates deeper in the viewer's mind. And this focusing of our attention culminates at the film's midpoint.
They're beating you, Bobby. You're playing into their hands.
The strategy's in place.
Then stop it. Just say stop.
In the absence of camera movement, our concentration is engulfed by one detail only.
It won't be stopped. Then fuck it. Life must mean nothing to you.
The dialogue.
God's gonna punish me.
Here, the image is virtually stripped bare of any visual flourishes. Neither character is facing the camera. The focus of each is solely placed on the other, and the weight of our attention is given equally to both, forcing us to really listen to what each character is saying in this verbal sparring match.
And you for your arrogance. Because my life is a real life, not some theological exercise.
McQueen could have easily cut the scene into various close-ups and reaction shots. Doing so certainly would have been easier when considering the difficulty of capturing this long take on film. But this would have meant losing the rhythm, pacing, and emotional arc that is created by staying still on the characters and really focusing on the dialogue within the scene.
I don't think I'm going to see you again, Bobby.
Yes, moving the camera can be incredibly powerful. It certainly has resulted in some of the most memorable scenes in film history. However, in choosing to keep the camera still, a film can wield just as much power.
One thing that has amazed me is I've had people talk to me about the use of Steadicam throughout the film. And I've kind of scratched my head because I think we've got 4 or 5 big dolly shots across the film. But other than that, every single camera is a static camera. And it's just, I guess these cuts in real time somehow gives us a feeling of fluidity.
In the absence of a zoom, pan, or cut to what's important, a filmmaker must rely on other tools. Whether that's lighting to create graphic contrast in relatively long-held frames, or successive cuts to black between a series of grainy vignettes. Playing with depth to communicate the emotions of characters.
Ben, that's a page 1 story.
Or sound to substitute a sonic close-up for a visual one. Filmmakers can use color, costume, and makeup, or body language blocking in set design. But knowing why you're moving the camera and using it intentionally to communicate meaning generates a more purposeful and visually interesting frame than simply using such movement because you can.
Sometimes I see cameras doing these amazingly elaborate things. I think, well, why? You know, and I go back to Antonioni or Jean-Pierre Melville, when the camera moves, there's a really deliberate point to what it's trying to say. And I think we tend to forget how powerful imagery can be in that way.